Two families, same city, same income, same $60,000 saved up. It's the year 2000. One family puts a down payment on a house. The other drops the whole amount into an S&P 500 index fund. They both forget about it. 24 years pass. So who came out ahead? The answer depends entirely on a question nobody ever asks, and it's not about the market. There's a belief in this country that goes deeper than politics, deeper than religion for some people. It's the belief that owning a home is the smartest financial move you can make. Your parents said it. Your grandparents said it. Every Thanksgiving dinner, some uncle leans back in his chair and says, "They're not making any more land." And for a long time, the numbers seem to back that up. The median home price in the U.S. in 1970 was about $17,000. By 2024, it had crossed $400,000. That looks like a rocket ship if you don't zoom in. On the other side, you've got stocks. The S&P 500, a basket of the 500 largest public companies in America, has averaged roughly 10% per year since 1928, according to data compiled by NYU finance professor Aswath Damodaran. That includes dividends. Adjusted for inflation, it's closer to 7%. Over nearly a century, through depressions, world wars, pandemics, and financial meltdowns, that number has held. So on the surface, you've got two heavyweights, but most people treat this like it's a simple math problem. Plug in the returns, compare the lines on a graph, declare a winner. It's not that simple. These two investments don't play by the same rules. They don't use the same scoreboard. And the biggest factor in which one wins has nothing to do with either of them. It has to do with you. Let's start with the stock market, because on paper, this is the cleaner investment. You open a brokerage account, you buy an index fund, and then, ideally, you do nothing. No tenants calling at 2 in the morning, no leaking roof, no property taxes, no closing costs. You sit there, and compound interest does the work. Put that in real numbers. If you'd invested $10,000 in the S&P 500 in 1980 and left it alone, reinvesting dividends, you'd have had over $1.4 million by 2024. That's not some cherry-picked time frame. That's 44 years of showing up through Black Monday, the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial crisis, and a global pandemic. And the engine behind it is compound growth, meaning your returns generate their own returns, and those returns generate more. The first decade barely moves the needle. Then, the curve bends upward like a hockey stick, but you only get that curve if you leave the money alone. The liquidity alone is a massive advantage. If you need to sell a stock, you open your phone, tap a button, and the cash is in your account within days. Try that with a house. The typical home in America sits on the market for about 60 days before going under contract, and then you've got another 30 to 45 days to close. That's 3 to 4 months if everything goes smoothly. If the market's soft, it could be 6 months or longer, and you're paying a real estate agent 5 to 6% of the sale price for the privilege. Stocks also let you start small. You can invest $5. You can invest $50. You don't need a credit check, a down payment, or an inspection. And diversification is built in. When you buy an index fund, you own a tiny slice of Apple, Johnson & Johnson, JP Morgan, and 497 other companies. Your risk is spread across the entire economy. With a house, you're making a concentrated bet on one property, in one neighborhood, in one city. But here's the honest part that stock enthusiasts don't like to bring up. The S&P 500 from 2000 to 2010 delivered a negative return. A full decade of nothing. Worse than nothing, in fact. Someone who invested right before the dot-com crash and held on hit another crash in 2008 before they'd even recovered from the first one. If you retired in 2002 and needed to sell, you were selling at a loss. If you retired in 2009, same story. Timing matters in ways that long-term averages hide. Volatility is the price of admission. In 2008 alone, the index dropped roughly 37%. In a single year, more than a third of your portfolio vanished on paper. In the COVID crash of 2020, it fell 34% in about 5 weeks. Both times, it recovered. But recovery requires one thing most people struggle with: doing absolutely nothing while your screen is red. And that word, on paper, does a lot of heavy lifting because most people don't just sit there. So the raw numbers favor stocks over long periods. That part isn't really debatable. But this comparison isn't raw numbers versus raw numbers. It's real estate with a mortgage versus stocks with a brokerage account. And that distinction changes everything. Real estate has a weapon that stocks, for most regular investors, simply don't offer. It's called leverage, which just means using borrowed money to control a larger asset. Say you want to buy a $300,000 house. You don't need $300,000. You need $60,000, a 20% down payment. The bank lends you the rest. Now imagine that house goes up in value by 5% in 1 year. That's a $15,000 gain. But you didn't invest $300,000. You invested $60,000. So your return on the money you put in isn't 5%. It's 25%. No mainstream brokerage account lets you do that with the same terms. You can trade stocks on margin, sure, but margin rates are higher, the broker can force you to sell if the value drops too far, and nobody gives you a 30-year margin loan at a fixed interest rate. A mortgage is the cheapest, longest-term leverage available to ordinary people in the entire financial system. Then there's the tax code. Real estate gets treatment that would make a stock investor jealous. Mortgage interest on an investment property is deductible, with no meaningful cap until your revenue hits $25 million. You can depreciate a residential rental property over 27 and a half years, meaning you write off the building's cost on paper even while it's gaining value in the real world. That's not a loophole, it's by design. The IRS lets you claim the building is wearing out, and that phantom loss reduces your taxable income every year. Then, when you sell, there's something called a 1031 exchange, named after Section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code. Sell one investment property, buy another of equal or greater value within 180 days, and you defer the capital gains tax entirely. You can keep rolling that forward indefinitely. Some investors chain 1031 exchanges across decades and never pay capital gains on real estate in their lifetime. With stocks, you sell, you pay. There's no equivalent deferral. There's also forced savings. A mortgage payment hits your bank account every month, whether you feel like investing or not. And a portion of every payment goes toward principal, meaning your ownership stake in the house grows automatically. You don't have to set up an auto transfer. You don't have to resist the urge to skip a month. The structure does it for you. Rental income adds another dimension. You can own a property, have a tenant cover most or all of the mortgage, and build equity with someone else's money while the property appreciates. That's not theoretical. That's how a significant portion of American millionaires built their wealth. But here's where you have to be honest about the other side of leverage. It magnifies gains, yes. It also magnifies losses. In 2008, national home prices dropped more than 30% from their peak. In some markets, like Las Vegas and Phoenix, they fell over 50%. By 2010, about 12 million homeowners, roughly 1 in 4 with a mortgage, owed more than their homes were worth. That's called being underwater. Between 2006 and 2014, nearly 10 million American families lost their homes to foreclosure. And there are costs that never show up in the real estate always goes up narrative. Maintenance runs 1 to 3% of a home's value every year. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, which has jumped 48% nationally since 2020. A Zillow and Thumbtack analysis found that the average homeowner's hidden annual costs, meaning maintenance, insurance, and property taxes combined, hit roughly $16,000 a year. Those costs don't exist in a stock portfolio. An index fund charges you maybe $3 a year for every $10,000 invested. Do you lean more toward real estate or stocks? And what made you choose? Here's where the conversation usually stalls. People pick a side and argue returns. But in 2017, a team of economists dropped a paper that scrambled the whole debate. Oscar Horda, Katharina Knoll, and their co-authors published The Rate of Return on Everything, 1870 to 2015, later picked up by the Quarterly Journal of Economics. They'd spent years building a dataset nobody had assembled before. Total returns for stocks, bonds, bills, and housing across 16 wealthy countries over 145 years. Their finding caught the financial world off guard. When you include rento income, not just price appreciation, housing and stocks delivered roughly the same real return, about 7% per year on average, almost identical. But here's the part that made it a puzzle. Housing did it with significantly less volatility. In the language of finance, housing offered a better risk-adjusted return, meaning you got the same destination with a smoother ride. That shocked a lot of people, because the standard assumption is that higher returns come with higher risk. Stocks are volatile, so they should reward you more. But housing, across 145 years and 16 countries, violated that assumption. There's a catch, though. The study measured returns on the asset itself, not returns on the investor's equity. In the real world, most people buy houses with mortgages. Leverage changes the risk profile completely. A leveraged house isn't a smooth ride anymore. It's a magnified one. Gains and losses amplified by whatever your loan-to-value ratio is. And the study also didn't account for the transaction costs, the illiquidity, and the time commitment that real estate demands from individual owners. So even the most comprehensive data we have doesn't settle the debate. It reframes it. The real separation between stocks and real estate lives somewhere no spreadsheet can measure. It lives in human behavior. Every year since 1994, a firm called Dalbar has published a study called the Quantitative Analysis of Investor Behavior. And every year, the finding is the same. The average stock investor dramatically underperforms the stock market. In 2024, the S&P 500 returned about 25%. The average equity fund investor earned 16.5%. That's an 8.5 percentage point gap, the second largest in a decade. It wasn't the market that failed them. It was their own decisions. The pattern repeats across decades. Investors pull money out during downturns, right before recoveries. They pile in during rallies, right before corrections. A 2026 study from the Allianz Center for the Future of Retirement found that 34% of Americans withdraw money from investments during a significant market drop to avoid further losses. Among millennials, that number was 67%. Real estate doesn't have this problem, at least not in the same way. You can't panic sell a house at 2 a.m. because the news scared you. There's no red ticker on your home's value dropping in real time. The friction, the very thing that makes real estate illiquid and inconvenient, is also what protects most owners from their worst impulses. You can't swipe to sell. You have to call an agent, sign paperwork, list it, wait for offers, negotiate, and close. By the time you could sell, the panic has usually passed. This is why a lot of people build more wealth through real estate than through stocks, even though stocks have better raw returns. The house forces you to stay in. The brokerage account makes it too easy to get out. A mortgage is a commitment device disguised as a financial product. There's a story that illustrates this, and it plays out in millions of households. Someone buys a home in their late 20s, makes their payments for 30 years. By their late 50s, the house is paid off, and it's worth 3 or 4 times what they paid. They feel wealthy, and in a real sense they are. The market didn't do them any special favors. Their timing wasn't brilliant. What worked was the structure of a 30-year mortgage that made the decision for them, month after month, whether they felt motivated or not. Meanwhile, that same person might have had a 401k the whole time. Contributions happened when motivation struck, which wasn't every paycheck. 2008 comes along, the balance drops 40% and the money moves to cash. In 2020, same reflex. Sold during the COVID crash. Missed a recovery that erased the losses within 5 months. Rebalancing? Never got around to it. But checking the balance every single day? That happened without fail. By their late 50s, the 401k has less in it than the equity in their home. Not because stocks performed worse, but because this person treated each investment completely differently. The structure did more work than the asset ever did. And then there are the people on the other side. The family that bought in Las Vegas in 2006 at the top of the bubble. They put 5% down on a $400,000 home. By 2010, it was worth $200,000. They were underwater by $200,000 on a property they couldn't sell and couldn't afford. They lost the house, their credit, and years of financial stability. Leverage gave them access. Leverage also destroyed them. So which one wins? The honest answer is that it depends on things that have nothing to do with historical returns. Start with behavior. If you're the type of person who will set up automatic contributions to an index fund and never look at it for 20 years, stocks will likely build you more wealth. The math is on your side, and the fees are minimal. But if you know, honestly, that you'll check the balance during every downturn and sell at the worst possible moment, real estate's built-in friction might save you from yourself. Then there's your timeline. Stocks need time to smooth out their volatility. Over any rolling 20-year period since 1928, the S&P 500 has never lost money. Every single one was positive. But within those 20 years, you'd have stomached drops of 30, 40, even 50%. Real estate appreciates more slowly, but doesn't show you a daily price, which is its own kind of advantage. And your access to leverage matters more than most people realize. None of this is me telling you to go buy a rental property or open a brokerage account tomorrow. That's between you and a financial advisor. But if you can qualify for a mortgage at a reasonable rate, real estate gives you the ability to control a large asset with a relatively small amount of cash. No other mainstream investment offers that to an ordinary person. But leverage only helps if the asset holds or gains value. If it drops, you're not just losing money. You're losing money you borrowed. There's also a middle ground most people overlook. REITs, which stands for Real Estate Investment Trusts, let you own shares in commercial real estate the same way you'd own shares of a company. You get exposure to property income and appreciation, you can buy and sell them on the stock market, and you don't have to fix a toilet at midnight. It's not a perfect substitute for owning a building, but for someone who wants both asset classes without the headaches of being a landlord, it's worth knowing about. The wealthiest investors don't commit to one side of this debate. Real estate gives them leverage, tax advantages, and forced savings. Stocks give them liquidity, diversification, and compound growth. The two solve different problems. Here's a mental model worth keeping. Don't ask which asset has the highest return. Ask which asset you'll hold through the worst day, the worst month, the worst year. Because the investment you sell at the bottom is always the worst investment you ever made, no matter what the long-term chart says. That family from the beginning, the one who bought the house and the one who bought the index fund, if both families stayed the course for 24 years, the index fund family likely came out ahead on raw dollars. The S&P 500 roughly quadrupled from 2000 to 2024. But the house family had something the other didn't, a structure that made quitting nearly impossible. No sell button, no daily price to panic over, just a payment every month, building equity whether they felt confident or not. And in the real world, the family that stays in wins more often than the family with the better asset on paper. If this changed how you think about it, hit like and subscribe.